Hello everyone, this is Aripsuyas here, and today we're going to be flashing our virtual Cisco C7200 router. It already has the normal firmware, but what we're trying to do is install the CME GUI. That's we're going to have a web GUI that allows us to do some basic things, basically just kind of configure phones and add extensions to them or give them phone numbers. So the first thing you have to do is actually flash it. I'm on the last leg of the flashing here. So you just go into router into enable mode and you do archive tar/extract tftp : and this IP is the IP of your TFTP. Now if you followed my previous guide here to set up your TFTP using Debian or Linux Mint or Ubuntu, then this is the IP that I've chosen. Now I just thought it was easier just to put the TFTP on the same computer as my CME, as my Dynamips is running here. And before you do that, you want to make sure that you have communication. Okay, so the biggest mistake I see that people, they kind of assume sometimes that things are working. So if you saw my previous guide, I would ping, and I'd also use the TFTP client to make sure that I can actually get this file, the CME.tar file. And finally, we're flashing it to disk 0, right? You have disk 0 : That's very important. A lot of people will just use flash. The C7200, in this case, just has disk 0. There is no flash. It will allow you to do that, well, to specify flash, but it's going to go nowhere because that doesn't exist, okay, on this router. So just make note of that. The other thing is, hopefully things go well. I've never really had any issues flashing, but I know some people do. Sometimes they'll have timeouts, and that means after it exceeds in starting, right? So you should see this like right away. The moment that you enter this command, you should see it. And if you don't, there's probably a problem. Another cool thing to watch as well, so I have my router on tap 1, so I can see that it's working, right? I'm using bmon. You can install bmon using sudo apt install bmon or bwm-ng, any bandwidth monitoring tool. And so I know it's working, right? Because I see it here. I see about 50 kilobytes per second, which is pretty normal, right? That's pretty normal for what you'd expect. And like I said, we're on the last leg here. It just takes quite a bit of time, right? It's not a very fast flash process here, so it's taking its time. But anyway, if any of you do get a timeout, a lot of times if people are having issues with performance, they'll note here, okay, on this bigger file here, the apps37 seccp.1-2-1-0.bin. Obviously, it's a bit of a larger file. Okay, and so a lot of times the reason that will happen is because you don't have an idle PC, basically. Your performance is not very good. So if you look here, guys, I've opened up top my Dynamips, right? That's my emulator for the router here. It's using about 40%, 37%, 40% CPU, which is not bad. Normally it actually idles at about maybe 5 or 6%, and that's because I've set an idle PC value. I'm going to give a link to how to do that. So for people having issues, if your CPU is at 100%, and it's going to be probably if you didn't set idle PC, so you're having issues if you have trouble flashing. And so I do recommend it. Some other weird symptoms of if your idle PC is not correct, or basically if you're having performance issues, that means you're pinging a router from another machine, and it's timing out. Like, say if you send 100 packets, and you only get back 50 or 80, anything less than 100% is unacceptable. It means you're having performance issues, and that's usually because Dynamips is not operating very well. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But personally, I've never had this issue. I've even not applied any idle PC in the past, and I've always been able to flash. But it really depends, right? And some people might think I have a really fast CPU, and I've seen some cases with people have monster CPUs, right? Really fast CPUs, even on a single core, like almost 4 gigahertz, okay? And they're still having issues sometimes. So it's kind of hit and miss. But just because you have the latest and fastest CPU does not mean you won't have this issue. Okay, so we're waiting for the flash to complete, and once we do, we're going to configure the GUI for CME here. So that's our goal, and just so there's no confusion, we actually don't need to use the CME GUI to do this, right? We don't really need to use any of these tools, but I think it's a great way to get into kind of having a visual concept of how the phones get registered, and also having having the concept of adding the phone number. But as you probably know, this can all be done from the CLI, but a lot of people do like to have the GUI access. Okay, so it's all done. Now the interesting thing is you can't necessarily watch the whole thing go through. If you leave it for a few minutes, you might come back and the console appears like this, right? Kind of kicks you out and it says return to get started. But anyway, it did succeed unless you have some timeouts. So in my case, yeah, I'm sure it's good because I never had any issues, and so things look fine here. But what I need to do now is I actually need to enable the CME GUI now that we've flashed it. Now, basically all we're doing when we're flashing is we're extracting that tar file, okay, the one that we talked about before. So let's enable it here, and let's do some config here, okay? I'm going to say IP HTTP server. I'm going to enable our web server there. Okay, I'm going to say our path is disk0/GUI. So this is where the GUI files are for the web server. So we want to specify this is the path we're pulling that from. Okay, then we want to go into telephony service. Now we don't actually have to do this here, but I think it's kind of simple and nice to do. Well, in this case, actually, we do have to first set our password though. Okay, so we're going to say web admin system. Okay, and the name, admin, password, and I'll just say, what do I say? I'll just call it a read pass. Okay, so what this did is it set our admin password, the username is admin, to password a read pass. Okay, then we're also going to enable web editing of DNs, that's basically phone numbers, and also the time. That's all we're going to enable at the moment. One other thing I think we should do while we're here is go back into telephony service here, and what we want to do is say max ePhones 2. You know what, if anything, guys, I'd say maybe even more. Okay, the reason I say that is if your phones are rebooting or you have any issues with the phones, CME may not actually recognize that one phone has kind of left, and so it might have kind of a zombie connection. And so when that phone tries to rejoin, you're going to get an error message saying that there's no more phones allowed. So why don't we just say 20, right? Anything more than, well, over 2. And I just say 2 because we're going to be starting with 2 phones. Obviously, in the real world, you want to specify a number that makes sense for you. And also keep in mind, too, depending on your version of a router and firmware, there are different limits, right? Different maximum amounts of phones that you can have. So you want to look up your router with Cisco there and figure out how many that maximum is, and make sure hopefully that it has enough limit for the use that you have and the office you have. Okay, so we've done that. Another important thing, guys, and this is based on my IP address here, but I'm going to set my source address to the IP of this router. Okay, so obviously my router has source address 192.168.5.1. Okay, and one more thing we have to do is we have to say we need some phone numbers. What are the maximum amount of phone number? We said we could have a maximum of 20 phones, ePhones. And also ePhones means that it's an SECP phone. Okay, how many phone numbers can we have? Well, I'll just say 25 arbitrarily. Obviously, if you need it more than that, then you'd have to change that. Another very useful thing I'd like to do is I'd probably say something like a system message, and we'll call it your name VoIP. Why don't we say Arib R1 VoIP? Okay, and this kind of makes it easy, for troubleshooting, especially when you're first getting started, to understand if you're connecting and where you're connecting from. Okay, so let's see what I mean in a second. And then also we have to do create CNF-files. Okay, so that's going to basically save our config for the phone stuff here. If we don't do that, then nothing's going to work. Okay, so once again, guys, before you get started, I recommend that you make sure your connectivity is good. Okay, so making sure everything makes sense. So let me go to one of my Windows VMs here. What do I mean by that? Let's do Control-R, go to CMD. What is my IP on this machine? Okay, it's 5.7. Okay, and you can set that statically, right? Just depending how you want to do it. In my case, before I started this, I actually created a DCP server that specifies option 150. And for those who don't know, option 150 is the TFTP server that the phone would try and register with. But I recommend you don't do that at first. I'll make a tutorial on how to do that later on. But what we're trying to do is just make a very basic setup, right? And just prove that our phones can connect and that they can call each other. Okay, so we're trying to get 2 phones going here. Another thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I can ping my router from here. Can I ping it? Okay, good. Yes, I can. And as well, I want to make sure I can ping in the opposite direction. Oops, wanted to say show. Okay, so good. I have two-way communication. Very important to make sure of that you have two-way communication. The other thing that I see people do is you want to make sure you don't have an IP conflict. More often than not, sometimes you accidentally give the same IP to another device. So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. But now I feel pretty confident that things should work. The other thing I've done here as well, I've disabled my Windows firewall. Okay, so definitely make sure, even if things appear to be working or pinging, trust me, disable your Windows firewall. It just leads to many issues for people that are kind of random and hard to find, because also Windows Defender is stateful. Okay, so you don't always have consistent results of it. And so like I said, this should be a testing environment, and I assume that it's safe to disable the firewall because it can definitely cause a lot of issues with your client. The other thing, obviously, is that your client side needs to have Cisco CIPC, Cisco IP Communicator. So I've already downloaded and installed it here. Let's go ahead and open it up. Let's see how we can configure this. Okay, and it looks like it's already, let me actually shut it down, guys. I've already had it open, so I already found my TFTP. Okay, let's open it here from scratch. Okay, and we can see it actually unregistered. Okay, and what you would do here is go to Preferences, and then Network. Now, I've used default TFTP. Like I said, I had an option 150, but you won't, right? Unless you've specified, a DHCP server somewhere that would do that. So what you want to do here is, say, use these TFTP servers and specify the IP of your router, of the CME router. So mine, once again, is 192.168.5.1. So I'm going to say OK. And it's going to go ahead and connect. And we can see it here. It's going to reboot now. So we'll see that it unregistered, and it's going to register again. Okay, and you'll know in a second. This error updating locale is normal, but the thing I want you to notice, guys, is that it says Arib R1 VoIP. So it's very, very useful. If you don't enable the system message, you may not really know what's going on, right? Now the phone might cycle, off and on saying registering every minute or so. But trust me, now the phone is in unconfigured state though. There's nothing that I can do, right? I can't even click on these buttons. I can't dial anywhere because the phone has no DN, it has no phone number. Okay, and that's where we have our CME GUI coming in. So how do I do this? And one more thing before I get started, let's check what is the file that I'm looking for here. It says SEP, right? Everything after SEP here is the MAC address. Now, in CIPC in Windows, it will base it off the actual computer's MAC address. Okay, so that's how it gets that MAC address. In real life, though, the phone is, obviously given a MAC address from Cisco, right? That's embedded into the hardware. And the device name, though, this is universal in Cisco, is it always have an SEP in front of it, right? And basically, what the phone actually doing when it's connecting is looking for an XML file in its name that helps it give it its config. Okay, so now that I've done that, I've enabled my CME GUI. Let's go here. And one more thing I want to show you guys is, watch this. Okay, so I'm going to type my username admin and repass. Let's see, does it work? No, it doesn't work. And the thing I want you guys to notice here is look at the HT access prompt here, saying the site says, quote, level 15 or view access. Okay, and then watch what I do here. Basically, we're just getting level 15 GUI access, which we haven't configured. Now let's go to CME.html. Now this is how we actually get to the CME GUI. If we don't go here, we're not getting there. Okay, and you'll see what I mean. So it's saying the site says ITS_access. So that's the difference, right? So make sure you're aware of that. Otherwise, you might be banging your head against the wall wondering why you cannot connect. Okay, so let's try now. Admin, and my password or repass. Does it work? Okay, great. So I'm in here. I'm in the CME GUI. So what can we do? Well, first we want to configure this phone. And the reason I have this screen up here is you want to know what phone that I'm talking about, right? And as you can see, the phone, like I said, is identified by the MAC address. So you have to match it up in here. So let's go to Configure and Phones. Okay, click on Add. And what do you know? I see two MAC addresses here. Okay, but how do I know which one that I want? let's just see what it ends in, right? It ends in EB8. Okay, EB8. Don't just click on it by default, right? There's another one here that ends in an EEA, right? But I know that this phone here in the drop-down of this phone, because I'm checking the MAC address, okay? We'll give it phone sequence number 1 by default. It already knows it's a CIPC phone and it's software client, so we'll click on Add. Okay, and we don't really need to do too much here. We're just trying to make it go. So we want to give it any account or any kind of management, and we'll say Add and save that change. Okay, so we can now see the phone here. And so, as it is now, the phone is there. Okay, but did anything change here? Do you see any phone number? No, there's no phone number for that. Okay, because remember, we haven't configured one. So let's give it a phone number. Let's go to Configure and Extensions. Okay, click on Add. Okay, and I'm going to call it extension 7861. Now, this could be any extension, right? That makes sense for you. We're just testing. So once again, sequence number, we'll say it's 1. We could say it's anything, right? It could be another sequence number. And notice, guys, it has up to 25. Now, the reason is the command that we entered on the router, right? When you said max-dn25. Now, if we had said like 200, then we could have a sequence number up to 200, right? So that's just how it's mapping it. So once again, let's just save this here, guys, okay? Okay, so that is now saved. Okay, so let's go to our router, to our R1. Okay, and now we're in telephony here. We're going to go to ePhone1, okay, because this is phone number 1. So make note of that. And how do we assign that extension? We're going to say button 1 colon 1. Now this is important to understand. If you don't understand this concept, you're going to start breaking your CME phones, okay? So the first one here, button 1, literally means button 1 on the phone. So if you look here, guys, this is button 1, right? It says line 1. So button 1 means line 1. We have line 2, 3, 4, right? All the way down to 8. So we could change that. But the reason why I say, and what we, by convention, we want to use 1 is because it will do it by default. And you see what I mean? It's inconvenient not to put your primary line when most users are only going to have one phone number, right? Unless they're maybe reception or sales or a call center, the majority of users are only going to have one line. So it becomes very inconvenient, as I'll explain later on. Okay, so 1, this means button 1 on our phone. The colon, or after the colon rather, this means DN number 1. Okay, now we can go see here in our CME to confirm what we're talking about. Now we go back here to extensions. Okay, sequence number 1, right? This means DN1, right? It's matching, okay? Just like if we look here under phones, if we say phone sequence 1, now it's really confusing, right? Because they're both 1s. So at this moment, if you go 1, 1, I mean, you can't really go wrong, right? Because we haven't added anything else. So just understand that ePhone1, right, is based on the sequence number. ePhone1 is this one, right, which is this one here, right? We know the MAC address matches. That's how we got into here by typing ePhone1. We're going to say button 1, 1, okay? And so the easiest way to let that apply is actually just to type restart now that we're inside this ePhone, okay? And give it about maybe 10 seconds. It's going to restart, and we're going to see that it gets that phone number that we assigned to it. Okay, so here, it says 7861. Okay, that's how we created our DN. Okay, does that make any sense? Hopefully it does, and you can see the phone came back online here. So all good stuff, right? So we're in pretty good shape now. But I want to show you something. The button thing is quite critical here. Now, let's say if I want to do maybe no button 1, 1. Okay, that's how we take it away. And let's restart this phone, right, just to confirm. Okay, so you'll see that the extension disappeared from up here and from up here. So we now have no extension. Just to really drive home the point of how button works, let's do it again. Okay, let's do button. How would I do button 8, 1? Okay, let's apply that by restarting, and let's see what happens. Okay, and look down here, guys. So now it's on the 8th button. So literally, the first number before the colon is talking about which button. Does it make sense to have it down here? And it will not really try and dial properly. What happens is if you don't assign it to the first button, when you want to dial out, you can't just dial the number and click dial. Okay, it won't pick it by default normally. See, it's not just going to work, and it wouldn't work anyway because we have no dial peers and no other phones to call. Okay, but let's just drive home the point about how it might work. So let's just change. Let's just take this away here, a no button 8.1. Okay, and change it back to 1.1 and give it a restart. I shouldn't say button no button 1.1. We'll say button 1.1. So I'm not sure if we held it on time for to read the new config, but let's see. Okay, so now it is here on that button. See, do you guys see the difference? It actually dialed. Right now, although it can't work and can't go anywhere, it actually dialed. When I had the button on 8, if I just click on dial, it doesn't work. Okay, so dial only works automatically with button 1, which is why we want to assign it to 1. That's really inconvenient for people to do. So that's why I say that it's a good convention to follow. Okay, so let's really drive home the point now. Let's go back and let's add another phone. Okay, we'll go back here, configure phones. I'm already in this menu. Click on add. The other interesting thing, guys, is that you'll see there's no other phone to add. Okay, I have another CIPC down here. Okay, that's running. But there's nothing else to actually add. And you'll see what I mean. Going back here, we only have a phone ending in EEA, like we saw before. We can't add a phone that we've already added. So these are phones that have registered, but they have no configuration because we haven't configured them. Okay, so let's go back here, go to Preferences. I'm going to change my network, that's back on default. I'm going to manually specify it. But the important thing at this moment is looking at the MAC address here. Okay, it's EEA. So that's how I know for sure I'm talking about that phone, right? Because imagine if you took a bunch of phones from different places, you may not know what phone that is. Okay, so we're going to say add. We cannot change this by default, right? This is going to be ePhone 2, at least in the GUI, we can't change it. Okay, we'll do our normal thing. And let's save it. Okay, and see, once again, it says phone sequence number. Also by default, it seems to have applied the same number, and we don't want that. Okay, so let's give it another DN. Okay, let's add. Let's call it 7862. Okay, so you can see it's all set up here. Okay, and now let's go back to our CLI and configure that. Now, once again, we see the sequence number is number 2. That means ePhone 2. Think ePhone 2, guys. Okay, so type ePhone 2. Now let's give it a proper extension, guys. Okay, because obviously as we have it now, that's not going to work. We had 2 phones with the same extension. That doesn't work. It breaks things. It's like the same idea as you have 2 IPs on the network that are the same. So we don't want that. So we go ePhone button. Remember, button number 1 means this button here. That's what we care about. Then colon. Now we know the sequence number for the other DN is 2. Okay, and then we're going to restart. Okay, good. So now we have that. And let's see, can they call each other now? Okay, let's dial 7861. Okay, yeah, it does seem to work. Can I call back in the other direction? Can I dial 7862 from here? Okay, so it's working. So I hope that shows you an easy way how to get started with just 2 phones on 1 CME router. Obviously, we can scale this as far as we want, as far as the as many phones as you have, and as much as your CME router permits you. So that's really the basics of how it works. In the next video idea, we'll talk more about dial peers, But the interesting thing that I want to stop with now is the fact that understand that to reach another phone, you need a dial peer. We did not explicitly define our own dial peer, but it's automatically created for us here, and that's basically because it knows, right? It knows that these two phones are reachable on the same router through a certain port, and we'll leave it at that. But it knows how to reach, so it doesn't have to really think very hard about how to make these phones talk together. Okay, so I hope that helps you get started. Once again, it is pretty simple to get started, but you just have to understand a few things about how the button works, how the sequence of the phone and the DN, right, and just a few things on the CLI. So I hope it's been helpful for you, and that it gets your CME going in no time. But it is not too hard as long as you have all this stuff working and going. It's a matter of making sure that you have communication between all of your devices. And if you haven't already, then check my other videos that show you how to get your bridge and your router going. Okay, thanks, and we'll see you next time.